hidden in plain sight. The produce truck crossed the port of entry at 6:14 in the morning, carrying paperwork that cleared every automated checkpoint without a single flag. The manifest listed 4,200 pounds of fresh jalapeno peppers, packed in standard commercial crates, temperature-controlled, origin documented, shipper registered, receiver verified. The driver had made this crossing 41 times in the previous 14 months. His commercial license was clean. The trucking company he worked for had a 3-year compliance record with 0 incidents. The produce consignment matched a legitimate buyer on the receiving end, a regional distribution warehouse that genuinely received commercial produce shipments from this shipper on a regular basis. Everything about the crossing was designed to be invisible. What was not on the manifest, what was sealed inside 116 specially fabricated compartments, built into the floors and sidewalls of 11 standard produce crates, was 287 pounds of pharmaceutical-grade fentanyl, pressed into counterfeit pill form, organized into distribution packaging, and scheduled for handoff to a regional distribution network within 18 hours of the truck clearing the border. At a street concentration capable of producing a lethal dose in quantities smaller than a few grains of salt, 287 pounds of fentanyl pressed into counterfeit pills represented a potential exposure risk to an estimated 65 million individual doses. The truck was allowed to continue. Federal investigators had known about it for 9 weeks. They had a task force of 81 agents positioned and waiting, and they needed the truck to complete its journey. Because the truck was not the operation. The truck was one thread. The operation was everything connected to it. A distribution network spanning 9 states, a financial infrastructure processing tens of millions of dollars in cartel revenue annually, and a corrupt insider network embedded inside legitimate freight logistics that had been moving product through official channels for more than 2 years without detection. This is ATF Trigger, and this is how federal investigators dismantled the most sophisticated fentanyl distribution operation ever intercepted through a commercial freight corridor, seizing 287 pounds of fentanyl, $34 million in documented cartel proceeds, and arresting 29 individuals across 9 states in a single coordinated operation that closed in 9 weeks of the investigation going active. The operation that morning had been scheduled for days. The arrest window had been narrowing, and the intelligence that finally locked in the timeline came not from a surveillance camera or a wiretap. It came from a produce crate. Part 1. The anomaly in the crate. Federal narcotics investigators working in coordination with U.S. Customs and Border Protection had been running an enhanced cargo screening program at a southwestern port of entry for 8 months when the first anomaly surfaced. The program used a layered approach, standard X-ray imaging supplemented by density analysis software capable of detecting inconsistencies in the material composition of commercial freight loads. Most of what the density analysis flagged was benign: improper packing, inconsistent load distribution, equipment failures. The false positive rate was high. That was understood going in. But in the 8th month of the program, a density analysis flag on a commercial produce shipment produced a result that the screening software's analytical engine rated as statistically inconsistent with any known variation in produce packing or equipment artifact. The flag was specific. It identified a pattern of localized high-density anomalies distributed across multiple crates in the shipment in a manner that was geometrically regular. Not random, not equipment-related. Regular, systematic, deliberately placed. The shipment in question was waved through. A secondary physical inspection at that stage would have alerted whoever was managing the operation that the port had identified something. The decision to pass the shipment and open an investigation was made within 40 minutes of the density flag being reviewed by a senior CBP officer and a DEA field supervisor who had been embedded with the screening program specifically to evaluate results of this kind. The shipment was followed. Federal surveillance units tracked the produce truck from the port of entry to its listed destination, the regional distribution warehouse. At the warehouse, the shipment was received, documented, and held for 48 hours in standard cold storage before being moved in a secondary internal transfer that had not been visible in any of the shipping documentation. Investigators documented the secondary transfer on video. 3 of the flagged crates were separated from the rest of the load and moved by warehouse staff into a section of the facility not covered by the warehouse's own internal security cameras, a blind spot that had been identified and exploited deliberately. The investigation had its first confirmed insider. Within 72 hours of the initial density flag, a federal task force had been formally constituted, drawing from the Drug Enforcement Administration, ATF, Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the relevant district. A court-authorized surveillance package was in place within 96 hours, covering communications, financial accounts, and physical locations connected to the warehouse and its staff. The 9-week investigation that followed would become what task force supervisors later described as one of the most systematically constructed narcotics interdiction cases in recent federal enforcement history. Not because of any single dramatic development, but because of the discipline with which investigators resisted the urge to act on partial information and instead allowed the full architecture of the network to reveal itself before moving. Part 2. The architecture of invisible freight. Understanding what the task force uncovered over those 9 weeks requires understanding the system the cartel network had built and how long it had taken to build it. The infrastructure that moved fentanyl through commercial produce shipments had been under development for more than 2 years before the density flag at the port of entry. It had been constructed with a level of deliberation and investment that reflected sophisticated organizational capability on the part of the cartel logistics division responsible for the corridor. At its foundation was a legitimate business, a mid-sized produce importing company with genuine commercial operations, genuine clients, and a genuine compliance history with U.S. Customs and Border authorities. The company had been established 7 years earlier and had operated legitimately for its first 5 years. The cartel acquisition of operational control through a combination of financial leverage over the ownership structure and the placement of cartel-aligned personnel in key operational roles had been gradual, deliberate, and designed to leave the company's legitimate compliance profile intact. The crate modification system was the centerpiece of the smuggling architecture. Investigators, working with forensic engineers contracted through the federal task force, ultimately documented a crate fabrication process that produced containers visually and structurally identical to standard commercial produce crates, but incorporating concealed internal compartments built from materials specifically selected to minimize their signature in standard X-ray screening. The compartment design had clearly been refined over multiple iterations. The fabrication quality and the material selection reflected accumulated knowledge of CBP screening capabilities. The crates were fabricated at a facility outside U.S. jurisdiction and introduced into the shipment cycle at the point of origin. They moved through the commercial logistics chain exactly as standard crates would, because externally they were indistinguishable from standard crates. The produce packed around and on top of the concealed compartments was genuine, sourced from legitimate suppliers, properly documented, accurately represented in shipping manifests. Inside the compartments, the fentanyl press output of a cartel manufacturing facility operating in a jurisdiction with limited federal law enforcement reach. Pharmaceutical-grade precursors, industrial pill presses, quality control processes that produced counterfeit pills indistinguishable visually from legitimate prescription opioid medications. The pills were pressed and packaged before insertion into the concealed crate compartments, sealed in commercial-grade vacuum packaging to control odor and protect against moisture damage during transit. By the time the crates reached the regional distribution warehouse, the product inside had been produced, pressed, packaged, concealed, transported across an international border, and documented through a complete paper trail that showed nothing but peppers. The warehouse was the first domestic node in the distribution architecture. From the warehouse, product moved outward through a freight broker network, a separate layer of the infrastructure, maintained by different personnel, connected to the import company through financial channels that had been carefully obscured behind multiple layers of corporate entities. The freight broker network dispatched product to secondary distribution points across 9 states using a combination of commercial trucking, courier services, and personal vehicle transfers managed through an encrypted coordination system. Investigators mapping the full distribution architecture estimated that, at full operational capacity, the system was moving product to end distribution networks in 9 states on a cycle of approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. The financial flows associated with the operation, documented through court-authorized access to financial records and through the forensic accounting work done by IRS criminal investigation agents embedded with the task force, indicated that the network had been generating between $180 million and $220 million in annual gross cartel revenue during its period of active operation. The warehouse insider was connected to 6 other individuals at the warehouse facility who had operational awareness of the secondary transfer process. The freight broker network involved 14 additional participants across the 9-state distribution system. The import company had 6 key personnel with direct operational involvement in the smuggling architecture, combined with leadership-level individuals connected to the cartel logistics division through the financial infrastructure. The total network participant count documented by investigators was 43 individuals operating at various levels of the operation. By week 7 of the investigation, the task force had evidentiary documentation on 29 of them sufficient to support federal prosecution. By week 8, the surveillance picture was complete enough that the task force could see the next shipment coming. Part 3. The 18-hour window. The intercept of an encrypted communication in week 8 of the investigation, obtained through a court-authorized order served on the platform provider, contained a date and a reference to a quantity that matched no legitimate produce shipment in the documented schedule of the import company. The date was 11 days away. The quantity reference, cross-referenced against the density analysis data from the initial anomaly flag and the forensic engineering assessment of the crate compartment capacity, was consistent with a shipment volume of 270 to 300 pounds of finished product. The task force had its operational window. The decision to allow the shipment to proceed to the domestic transfer point, rather than interdict it at the border, was a deliberate investigative choice made after extensive consultation between the task force and federal prosecutors. Interdiction at the border would have secured the product and potentially arrested the driver, but it would have left the domestic distribution architecture intact. The warehouse insider network, the freight broker system, the 9-state distribution chain, all of it would have been alerted, and the most significant law enforcement opportunity in 2 years of cartel corridor activity would have produced a single arrest and a driver-level seizure. The task force chose differently. The truck was allowed to cross. The density analysis system, upgraded over the 9 weeks since the initial flag to incorporate the specific material signatures identified in the forensic engineering assessment, confirmed the presence of concealed cargo. Surveillance units picked up the truck at the border and maintained continuous coverage as it traveled the 340 miles to the warehouse facility, arriving at 6:14 in the morning and completing the standard receiving process by 8 a.m. At 9:23 a.m., warehouse surveillance documented the secondary transfer of 4 crates. The number had increased from the 3 observed in the initial shipment to the facility's camera blind section. At 10:47 a.m., An outbound freight vehicle left the warehouse carrying the transferred crates under a legitimate commercial freight manifest listing industrial cleaning supplies as cargo. The outbound vehicle was followed. It made 3 stops over the following 6 hours. At each stop, a partial transfer of product was made, a distribution pattern that investigators recognized as consistent with a hub and spoke model in which the warehouse served as the primary node and regional sub-distributors received their allocated share of each shipment in sequential handoffs. The stops were documented on video by surveillance units maintaining coverage from multiple angles. At 4:31 p.m., the task force supervisor confirmed that all 3 secondary distribution handoffs had been completed, and that the recipients of each handoff were under surveillance at their respective locations. The 18-hour clock that started when the truck cleared the port of entry was at 15 hours and 17 minutes. The task force executed Part 4, 81 agents, 9 states, 1 morning. The simultaneous arrest and search warrant execution that closed the investigation involved 81 federal agents operating across 9 states in a coordinated action that had been rehearsed in tabletop exercises over the final 2 weeks of the investigation. The coordination challenge was significant. The geographic spread of the operation, the number of simultaneous entries required, and the need to prevent any single arrest or search from triggering a communications alert that would reach other network participants before they could be secured, all required a level of operational synchronization rarely achieved in multi-state narcotics operations. Every entry was timed to within a 2-minute window of the others. At 5 a.m., the operation went active. At the warehouse facility, agents secured the building and took 6 individuals into custody before 5:15 a.m. The secondary transfer area, the camera blind section, was found to contain packaging materials, concealment equipment, and residual product that had not been included in the outbound transfer. Forensic teams documented the space and its contents comprehensively. At the import company's operational headquarters, agents secured 3 individuals with direct involvement in the smuggling architecture and executed search warrants covering digital equipment, financial records, and communications infrastructure. Forensic accountants working with the task force began their on-site review immediately. At 14 secondary locations across the 9-state distribution network, additional agents executed simultaneous arrest and search warrants covering regional sub-distributors and the freight broker network participants. At 11 of the 14 locations, product was recovered. The distributed remnants of the shipment that had moved through the warehouse handoff the previous afternoon. The accounting that emerged from the full operation inventory took 36 hours to complete. Total fentanyl recovered across all locations. 287 pounds in finished counterfeit pill form, 23 pounds in unfinished pressed tablet form, recovered from a secondary processing location identified during the warehouse search, and 14 pounds of unpressed pharmaceutical-grade precursor material recovered from a freight broker location that served as a secondary staging point. Total, 324 pounds of fentanyl across 3 product categories. At the street-level distribution concentration documented in the seizure, the finished pill inventory alone represented between 58 million and 65 million individual doses. The combined recovery represented one of the largest single-operation fentanyl seizures documented in federal enforcement records through a commercial freight corridor. Financial instruments and assets seized pursuant to forfeiture proceedings. $34 million in documented cartel proceeds across bank accounts, physical currency, and documented asset positions identified through the forensic accounting review. The accounts connected to the import company's shadow financial architecture led investigators to additional financial infrastructure in 2 additional countries, referrals for which were forwarded to the relevant international law enforcement liaison offices. Individuals taken into custody: 29. The remaining 14 network participants identified during the investigation, individuals whose evidentiary documentation did not reach the threshold for immediate arrest warrant, were the subject of ongoing investigative referrals. The commercial vehicle that had crossed the border at 6:14 a.m., carrying 287 pounds of fentanyl in fabricated crate compartments, was impounded as evidence. The driver, who had made 41 prior crossings, was among those arrested. The import company's business operations were suspended pending forfeiture proceedings. The distribution network that had been moving product to 9 states never received its next scheduled shipment. The 18-hour window from border crossing to task force execution had closed completely. Part-time, the cost of invisible cargo. In the days after the operation concluded, federal prosecutors and task force supervisors participated in a closed briefing for relevant congressional oversight staff. The briefing covered the technical details of the investigation, the legal framework under which it had been conducted, and the quantified assessment of what the operation had prevented. The assessment was built on documented data. The distribution pattern of the network as established through 9 weeks of surveillance, the rate at which product had been moving through the system over its documented period of operation, the street-level concentration at which fentanyl pressed into counterfeit pill form reaches lethal dose thresholds, and the epidemiological data on fentanyl-related mortality compiled by federal public health agencies. The numbers were specific, and they were severe. At the distribution rate documented for the network, approximately 270 to 300 pounds per shipment cycle, approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. The operation had been moving a volume of product sufficient to supply a 9-state distribution network at a scale that, if translated into street-level dose units, represented a significant fraction of documented fentanyl exposure in the affected geographic area. Forensic accountants estimated that the network had been fully operational for approximately 26 months before the investigation intercepted it. The assessment of what a single shipment cycle delivered to the distribution network would have produced in terms of human exposure was the number that the briefing room absorbed in silence. 65 million individual doses of fentanyl in counterfeit pill form, moving through a 9-state distribution system to street-level markets, with a lethal dose threshold measured in micrograms per kilogram of body weight. The briefing document noted in its summary section that the shipment that crossed at 6:14 a.m. had been moving on a schedule. The next one would have followed in 3 to 4 weeks, and the one after that. The investigation ended the schedule. What it did not end, because no single investigation ends a cartel's operational ambitions, was the underlying structural incentive that makes this kind of operation continuously attractive to the organizations that build them. The produce corridor, the fabricated crates, the insider network at the warehouse, the freight broker distribution chain. These are all replaceable components. Cartels replace them. They adapt. They invest in the next version of the architecture. What the investigation demonstrated is that the detection capability adapts too. The density analysis program that flagged the initial anomaly was an 8-month-old enhancement to a screening process that had been operating for years. The cross-agency task force framework that translated the flag into a 9-week investigation was the product of institutional investment in exactly the kind of coordinated response capability that single-agency approaches cannot replicate. The forensic engineering capacity that decoded the crate compartment design, the IRS forensic accounting embedded in the task force, the court-authorized digital surveillance of encrypted communications, each of these represented a capability developed specifically because previous cases had demonstrated its necessity. The cartel had spent 2 years building an architecture it believed was invisible. Federal investigators had spent years building the capability to find it. The density flag at 6:14 in the morning was the moment those 2 timelines intersected. A ATF Trigger covers the operations. the simultaneous entries, the seizure numbers, the arrest counts. It also covers what those numbers represent: the doses that never reached the street, the communities that received one fewer shipment cycle, the 18-hour window that closed before the distribution handoffs could be completed, 287 pounds of fentanyl hidden inside produce crates, crossing a federal border at 6:14 in the morning. 81 federal agents knew it was coming. The cartel did not know they knew. All information presented in this production is drawn from fictional dramatization of federal law enforcement concepts and documented investigative methodologies. No real cases, real individuals, or specific operations are depicted. ATF Trigger produces content for educational and informational purposes related to federal law enforcement procedures and capabilities. This production does not represent official communications from any federal agency